The beautiful day.
Good morning, Ayin Beis, volume 3. We are on the top of page, bottom of page 1456. 1456. Bnei Yerushalayim is the level of souls as they are in Atzilus, especially in the state of Ibbur, where they are one, like in the example with the mother, not as an independent entity. So there is a fetus, there is something that is not Atzilus itself, but it's one with Atzilus, it's united with it. That's like the Ibbur b'yerachimai, Ibbur yerachimai, the Ibbur b'mei imai, as we learned in the previous paragraph. And then there's the latest hanashamas that separate from the kelim of Atzilus, in the words of the Alter Rebbe in Ageres HaKedesh 20. And what it appears that that's most likely the level of Atzilus as it's moving toward Beriyah. And then there's how it manifests in Beriyah itself, which we're going to learn about these different levels. So the inyan in this is to understand this well. This, of course, is the context of the pasuk Shcheirani, that the neshamas below that are manifest in this world, in a physical body, in an animal soul, say, I am dark and beautiful. They're saying that to the neshamas above in Atzilus that are in a state of utter bittul, yiras shalom. Not just bittul, but total bittul, shalom. Like he called it yiri Allah, completely consumed through the seeing and experiencing the divine like you do with vision. And to explain this level, he continues by Inyanhu to understand the difference between Atzilus and Beriyah. Also, Atzilus as it manifests in Beriyah. And what is that? We see there's a parsa between the two, a partition, a curtain. And just like a curtain, a physical curtain, what does it do? It diffuses the light and conceals it, allowing in something, but it's not like the original light. The same thing here, the parsa, the masach, the curtain, the kav that radiates in the Atzilus is still the parsa. Once it reaches the parsa, it says, V'sham istayim ha'or. The or concludes, ends there. Now we understand ending there doesn't mean actually end, because we see there's definitely something that's coming through on the other side of the curtain. But he means what ends is the kav itself. The kav, the original kav, is not radiating and illuminating and shining. It's only a reflection, like he says. So it doesn't radiate or illuminate in Beriyah because of the partition that separates. And what does pierce the partition? He calls that ha'ara da'ara, a reflection of a reflection, which is considered to be a ha'ara nivdelas, like a separate reflection, which means it's still a reflection from the original source, but it's gone through a quantum leap or paradigm shift that's causing it to not be the way it is in its original state. To the point, shebe'ein areich legabe etzem ha'or. Shebe'ein areich means it's not a gradual, it's not a incremental leap, it's actually a quantum leap. Ein areich, like an infinite distance. The gamma shemer lehedya b'bkiyas aparsa, and also the that ultimately does shine between the parsa, which is called Atzilus sheba Beriyah, because remember the kav is radiating Atzilus, so it's now moving into Beriyah, which he calls the kelim of malchus that become the nefesh ruach neshama of Biy'a, which is the lakus of Atzilus is radiating in Beriyah. And the Eir HaKav is part of that process. Again, a reflection of the Eir HaKav, and a separate leap, like a separate with a so-called a partition. You can even say a hefsek a type of pause. So with all that, it's still not like the kav is an Atzilus. So that establishes the distinction between these two levels. And then he breaks it down into a few more details. Number one, Commission is barely ill that the kalim of Atzilus, as they go into Biy'a, they become more, they break down into more details, Ribuy kalim, and diminished light. And the additional that in Atzilus, it's all in a state of iskalus and isardus. So there are two distinctions. One is that as it goes into Beriyah, the kalim become more number of containers and less oir, whereas in Atzilus it's less containers and more oir and more energy, which makes sense. I gave the example of a teacher to an advanced student, a teacher to a lesser student, uses more words and has to diminish the idea to some extent. And the second thing he says, V'gam, that in Atzilus, in addition to the point that we just made, there's also a sardus and iskalus and sardus. Everything is interconnected and united. And in Biy'a, Mashakin in Biy'a, Harizela Madregas Protis. You don't see that much the same level of called synchronicity or cohesion or synergy, but you see more the details, which of course is connected to the first point. Because when you say the kalim become more and the oir is less, inevitably that means there's going to be less achdus and iskalus. But he does state it as 2 points. Okay. And he gave the example for this, the difference between the Shechina, as it's in each individual. Everybody has the Shechina residing within them by virtue of their soul. And yet we still say when 10 people come together, there's a deeper level of the Shechina. So what does that mean? Because when individually, the divine energy is manifesting in that particular spark, in that individual. Even Moshe Rabbeinu is an individual in that sense. But when you have, like you said, Ba'asara daf k'shchina sheira, because Ba'asara, that captures the entire synergy, the entire inclusive energy of Atzilus, all the 10 spheres, but Sir Kema Shlema, you see an entire structure. So it'd be like the difference between saying the value of an individual versus the value of the community. Of course, the individual is never compromised. The individual is valuable. But there's something that happens when you have the entire community, because then you have all the diverse elements that create a full entity. It would be like when you speak about the spheres themselves. Chachma is Chachma, Bina is Bina. But there's something that added when you have all 10, like in a human being has faculties. So the faculty of the mind is a powerful faculty. The faculty of chesed, of love, is also a powerful faculty. And both are divine attributes and divine creations. And yet, when you say a human being, a healthy human being is the entire body. It's an entire being. And that's the distinction. So in Beriyah and Biy'a, what happens is the detail is the focus, the specific detail. And in Atzilus, there you have that synergy of the entire structure of all the 10 spheres. So that explains the difference, and that's why the parsa is the force that affects this leap to go from a state of such type of utter unity and synchronicity and cohesion and synergy and all the words I used and all the other details and all the other aspects that he spoke about, to move to Beriyah. It doesn't just happen. The parsa is what diffuses the oir and weakens it to allow the details to begin to emerge. Now, let's not forget that in Atzilus there's also details. It's 10 spheres, 10 and not 9, and 10 and not 11. But the emphasis there is on the whole. It's like looking at a building, the whole human being, not just one component or part of it. That's what we've learned. And this is all, as I said, coming to explain Bnei Yerushalayim, which we'll get back to. He's going to continue now explaining the quality of Atzilus in contrast to Beriyah. And just for the record, again, Atzilus the Biy'a, though he's speaking here, the microcosm, it also, you can also apply it to the macrocosm, though he's not discussing that here, which would be Atzilus the Klolus of the Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum, and Beriyah the Klolus, which is Ak, just for the general record. But again, Chassidus definitely does not, if it doesn't mention that, it's usually talking about the regular, I wouldn't call it regular, but the microcosm of these worlds, not the macrocosm. Okay. Now he continues. You see here, giving step-by-step distinctions between Atzilus and Beriyah. U'kamoy kain, so 3 lines from the bottom of the page, 1456. Pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. We have the PDF scanned of all these pages. So it says, U'kamoy kain, b'sfiras da'atzilus gufa, in the spheres of Atzilus themselves, the Atzilus, one second, the Atzilus, that the spheres of Atzilus themselves, in Atzilus, who call es spheres b'sachdus, meir behem etzem ha'er. Let me read the song differently. No, I didn't phrase it right. Same thing within the spheres of Atzilus themselves, like Kama. And what about the spheres of Atzilus themselves? We just learned about Atzilus who call us spheres b'sachdus. All the 10 spheres are united. We just learned that a few lines earlier. It said b'skalus u'b'sachdus. That's like the Shechinta Sharia of 10 people. He says, Meir behem etzem ha'er. So he's now adding another element that in Atzilus also radiates the etzem ha'er. That he hasn't said yet. He said it radiates the kav. You have the muhus of the kav. He said also that there's more er and not yet the breakdown of the details of the kelim as much as they are in Biy'a. And finally said that it's hiskalus isachdus. So he's adding one more thing now, that Atzilus also radiates etzem ha'er. Even though the etzem ha'er is higher than Atzilus, but Atzilus manifests that etzem ha'er. It radiates there. Now, just to spell it out, he doesn't spell it out here, but earlier, both in this volume and earlier volumes, he generally spoke about 3 levels of Oir. You may remember this. If not, I'll just quickly summarize it. He said there's the Oir Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum, we know. But then he says there are 3 stages that the Oir goes through. There's Etzem Oir. That's like the Oir as it's pure and pristine, just reflecting the divine power. So we say, what is Oir? Like sunlight to the sun. That God is expressing himself through revelation, revealing himself, expressing himself. That's Etzem Oir. We're not talking there about Oir relating to existence. The second level is Oir that is higher than the Kelim, but it's already relating to them. So the Oir has now moved to the next level, like before the Tzimtzum, where God is arising in his desire and he's beginning to envision existence. But it's still the Oir higher than Kelim. That would be like Seviv Kalam. And then there's Mamala Kalam. There's the Oir as it's mislabish b'Kelim. The Oir as it manifests in containers and actual structure. That's Atzilus. So we learned that length earlier in Ayin Beis, that the Oir goes through these 3 stages. But even when it comes into Atzilus, the Oiris and Kelim, that doesn't mean Atzilus is disconnected from the Etzem Oir. It's not the Etzem Oir because it is now a structured world of Chachma, Bina, and all the spheres. But it still carries and senses the purpose of existence. It senses the purpose of it all, which is the Etzem Oir. The Etzem Oir is basically what is God's intention in creation. I don't mean necessarily kavanah. It's like as close as it gets to God expressing what does he want with his building. So that's is a reflection of God, of the divine aspect of it. The Oir and the Kelim is already discussing the details, Chachma Bina. However, the details are Beisachdus, like he said. Where in Biy'a, the details are now coming separate. So Beisachdus, it would be like the Ibbur, like the fetus. There are details, but they're still part of the original mother. If you may recall, in Keseh, the spheres are like the Ratzon for Chachma, the Ratzon for Bina. And even higher than that is the Etzem Ha'er. So he's saying here that in Atzilus, you don't just have the unifying vision of all the spheres, but that's the Isachdus, the unification of it all, and the synergy that we said, but you also have Etzem Ha'er, which means you have something higher than the Eir that manifests within the containers. And he's now going to explain what that level is. So what we're getting here is that Atzilus has yet another virtue that Biy'a does not have on its own. The Yesh Leimer, what is this level of Etzem Ha'er? He says, this is the level of the Eir Ha'el al Kulona, which we mentioned yesterday, but now he's spelling it out. Eir Ha'el al Kulona literally means the energy that arises above them all. It's essentially synergy, even though I used that word before with the Isachdus, but here it's on a higher level. It's the synergy that happens when you bring together details. There's something that's added that was not there before. You could have many details come together and you sense a unity, a synchronicity, like the harmony of within diversity of a human body, or the harmony of a community, a Sarashchinta Sharia. When Jews are together and there's Avos Yisrael and Achdus Yisrael, that's a harmony. But now there's another thing that happens when you have that unification. What happens is another higher energy hovers above it. And the example is like the word Baruch. I mentioned that. 4 different letters, Beis, Reis, Vav, Chaf. They come together. So firstly, you have a word. The word that is a cohesive word, which is made up of 4 letters. But you have something more than just a word, a united word. You have a word that has a meaning of blessing. And the Beis alone, the Reish alone, the Vav and the Chaf, even though you can't have the word without those letters, but something is added that's so-called more than the sum of the parts. Another example given to this is from the Gemara in Seita. The Gemara in Seita, that the Rashi brings it in Parsha Shlach, that when the scouts, the Meraglim, went to scout out Israel, they came back with these big, large, giant fruit. So the Gemara calculates how they carried it, how many people were necessary to carry these great, large fruit. And there's a statement in the Gemara in Aramaic, I'll translate it, that when 2 people carry something, they carry more than the sum total of both of them. Which means, if you can lift 100 pounds and I can lift 100 pounds, together we can lift more than 200 pounds. There's some additional so-called invisible extra something that happens when 2 people come together. And that grows exponentially when you add 3 people. In other words, 3 people, it's not just 300 and some pounds, but it's as each individual that's added adds another element besides their own strength, something that happens through the collective. So that's a scientific fact. So the same idea, Eir Ha'el al Kulona, that the Achdus of Atzilus also is a keli to draw from the Etzem Ha'er, which means God's higher purpose, not just the purpose in Chachma and Bina and their unity, but the Etzem Ha'er. That's what we discussed earlier, recession is Beriyah. That's back in chapter 27. It really starts there in chapter 23, the concept, but Eir al Kulona, that's expression, and that idea is in chapter 27, all the way early part of volume 1 of Ayin Beis. So what he says there is like this: the 10 hidden spheres are not the 10 spheres of Atzilus. The 10 spheres of Atzilus are called Esses spheres Hagluyas. They're revealed spheres. But where do they originate from? From the 10 hidden spheres. So Atzilus, you have an illumination, an energy that's flowing into it from the 10 hidden spheres, which what he calls is Etzem Ha'er, Eir Ha'el al Kulona, Shesham Kol Esses spheres Hein by Achdus Mamish. There, all the 10 spheres are mamish b'sachdus. What does he mean by mamish? More than in Atzilus. In Atzilus, it's like a body, like an Ibbur. You have 10 spheres, but they're all united in one harmony. That's the Sachdus. Hasagdus Mamish, you can't even distinguish between them. Even though there's a conceptual Chachma Bina, but they're on a level that have not yet manifest in details. Think of like the one cell upon conception. It's very different than the child once it develops into a full body with limbs and organs and so on. But afterwards, in contrast to the 10 hidden spheres, is once the spheres come down in detail, pratis. So let's continue. I just went on to the next page 1457. And he says like this. So before we continue, so what do we have here? Two states. One is Etzem Ha'er, which he calls the Eir El Al Kolona, which is the 10 hidden spheres, where all the spheres are like one. And then there's how the spheres come detailed. So he says, V'nizboy le'il. And we learned earlier, and now he's referring to page Aleph Tov Mem Ches, 1448. Basically 8 pages back, he said, the Atzilus kol spheres saying ba'achdus mamish. In Atzilus, all the 10 spheres are achdus mamish. He's using the word mamish here too. Dugmas b'chinas ha'akudim. He compared it to the akudim, which are 10 energies in one container. Obviously, it's not the level of akudim, but in the concept of achdus, there's a certain element of unification. He compared that on page 1448. Said that explicitly, middle of the page. Well, first third of the page. He gave that as an example. Yeah. And Al-Kain, and therefore, Be'eses spheres Atzilus. So how is this possible? Is because in that, and therefore, the 10 spheres of Atzilus, Meir Behem Eir Elyon Levad, B'chinas Ha'er HaMislabish B'Seicham. And the reason, and therefore, because of that Achdus Mamish, you can say both ways. Because of that, that's why radiates the Eir Elyon Yeser, which is the Eir El Kolona from the Esser Spheres Sagnuzis. In addition, besides the divine energy that manifests within the spheres of Atzilus. So now you have this hovering synergetic effect that's more than the sum of the parts. The truth is, you could say it both ways. It's because in Atzilus radiates from that level. That's why Atzilus is Achdus Mamish, even though in the actual language here he's saying the other way around. Because Atzilus is such a unified state, that's why when the spheres come together, you get an additional energy, the Etzem Ha'er, that's more than just the Eir within the Kalim that are mislabish, but within Atzilus. So that's all in Atzilus. So we've added now yet another element. So 3 things. In Atzilus is less containers and more Eir. In Atzilus it's Hisachdus and Iskalus, like Shchinta Shaya. And in Atzilus you have Etzem Ha'er from higher levels. Moshe Kain. Okay, not Moshe Kain. Then he continues. Now, by contrast, let's just now conclude the context. The context here. Ukashakelim de Malchus nimshachim b'Biy'a. Now, when the Kalim of Malchus of Atzilus now transmit into Biy'a, which means after the Parsa, Shazel Madregas Protis, now it's coming down to Madregas Protis, specific levels like we said earlier about Biy'a. This energy, this Etzem Ha'er, as well as the other aspects that he speaks, but even the Etzem Ha'er does not radiate in Biy'a. This is apparently referring back also to chapter 27. That this distinction here is between siluk and miyut. So that needs explanation what that means. So let me just briefly explain it, and then I'll stop here. And then he's going to, and for questions, and then continue about the neshamas. So what he says back there, siluk and miyut, is that from Atzilus from the 10 hidden spheres to Atzilus, he says it's miyut. Because the 10 spheres of Atzilus are under the effect of the hidden spheres as they are in their source, so it's only a form of miyut. It's a diminishment. Whereas when it goes into Biy'a, it requires a much more asiluk. A siluk is like a far deeper leap, a greater leap, a bigger of a paradigm shift. That's most likely what he's referring to when he says siluk and miyut here, to distinguish between Biy'a and Atzilus, how they're receiving from the higher levels. So the parsa creates a state of siluk, whereas opposed to Atzilus, there's only a state of miyut. So Atzilus is lower than the 10 hidden spheres. He doesn't say the 10 hidden spheres are Atzilus. He's saying the 10 hidden spheres radiate in Atzilus. And that's why, and because Atzilus, that's the Agdus Mamish that dominates in Atzilus, a total unified cohesiveness with the synergy that we discussed that connects to the levels that are higher than Atzilus. Etzema. So there you have a distinguish between Atzilus and Biy'a, which is all setting the stage to come back. Now let's understand the souls. How does it work with the souls as they travel from Atzilus into Biy'a? And that's going to be the next piece. But I'll stop here if anybody has any questions on what we just learned this morning, so far in this class, and then I'm ready to continue. Any questions? Okay. So now let's go and understand what happens now with the souls. We learned that the souls also have a state of how they are in Atzilus, like Ibbur, where they're part and one with the mother, with the source. There's a state of Leda, they're born, and then there's a state how they become Neshama de Beriyah. So there's Atzilus Sheba Beriyah, and there's Beriyah itself. So let's see how he spells it out now in this context. Now that we understand the difference between Atzilus and Beriyah, let's understand how it works with the souls. So it says now like this, fourth line on top of page 1457. Well, Kamoy Kain, just as it is with what we just discussed, the difference between Atzilus and Biy'a, and Beriyah Tzirasiyah, Kamoy Kain Yuvan ben Neshamas. We'll also understand now how it works with the souls. The Kamoy Sheyardul Biy'a, because as the souls descended into Beriyah Tzirasiyah from Atzilus, Gam b'bchinas Atzilus sheba Biy'a. He clearly emphasizing, like he did before the beginning of the paragraph of the last page. If you remember, he said Atzilus sheba Beriyah. So we're not just talking about Atzilus to Biy'a, even Atzilus that manifests in Biy'a, because there's Atzilus in Biy'a. Ein ze be'erech k'mo she'en ba'Atzilus atzmei. So the very neshamas of Atzilus, even as they remain neshamas of Atzilus, but they have now entered in Biy'a, you can't compare them to the way they are in Atzilus itself. B'yesem klulim b'pchinas pnimius hakelim de malchus. When they were included, encompassed in the inner containers of malchus. Shemeir behem erakav mamish. There, what's radiating them is the direct artery, the direct supply line, the food pipe, whatever you want to call it, of the kav is directly feeding into them. Kameshu batzilus. Shemeir behem erakav mamish kameshu batzilus, the way it is in Atzilus. Because in Beriyah, even when Atzilus is descending into Beriyah, it doesn't have quite that connection. Like the language of the Geras HaKodesh, Nisrachku, he says, Min HaKav. That was the language he used. Just want to see the exact language. Yeah. Meruchakim Min HaKav. Shekvar Yotzu v'nifredu ma'akelim. You can say that the Rebbe Rashab is actually explaining the Geras HaKodesh and explaining the words. He says clearly, it's meruchakim, it's distant from the kav, and yotzu v'nifredu. They left and separated from the kalim. Talking about even the shamas of Atzilus. So that's the distinction here. V'gam, continuing on, v'gam b'chinas ha'er she'beklolos ha'esesfiras d'Atzilus. One second, maybe I didn't read that right. Yes. Okay, Einze be'erech. It's all going back. You cannot compare the Atzilus as the neshamas come into Biy'a. Even Atzilus coming into Biy'a. You can't compare it to the way it is Atzilus itself. The gam b'chinas ha'er she'bechol ha'esesfiras d'Atzilus. And you also can compare it to the general Oyer as it is in the general 10 spheres, like we learned. Because there everything is on a higher united level and an interconnected level. Mashenkin k'sheyardu lebiyah. By contrast, when the souls have now come to Biy'a, and they're not in that state of Atzilus, shagam b'chinas Atzilus mashenkin k'sheyardu lebiyah, shagam b'chinas Atzilus shebiyah, ena er kamei ba'Atzilus. Canal. Repeats again the same idea. That when it comes to Biy'a, including the level of Atzilus in Biy'a, ena er kamei ba'Atzilus. It's not the er as it is in Atzilus. Similar to the difference between the pregnancy and birth. Doesn't say that explicitly here, but he's going to say it soon. But that's the idea. So, and the explanation that he gave with the parsa and the actual distinction between Atzilus and Biy'a tells us what that means. It means the neshamas and Atzilus themselves are under the influence and are sensing and their consciousness is one that senses the oir and they saw and the oir, not so much the details, and the sachnus and iskaulus, the unity and the interconnectivity and the unity, and the etzema oir ha'elal kulana, the synergy. That's neshamas and Atzilus. But when they come into Biy'a, those elements become concealed to some extent, at least, or to a large extent. Because in Biy'a, now the focus is on the specific details, and that makes sense. Because the neshama, if it's under the influence of that higher level of energy, will not be able to focus on doing its work as it comes down below. So the neshama has to go through these stages. This isn't a punishment. This isn't a tragedy. This is exactly the way it's meant to be. The neshama has to come down and engage with existence. It hasn't come down all the way yet. We haven't talked about how it comes into Yitzira and Asiya, and ultimately Shcheirani, this world where it manifests in the body and animal soul, but that's the direction it's headed. So now we have a stage, we see the neshama says they are still basking in that utter unity of Atzilus, and how they have now come down a level into Biy'a after the partition. Okay, so it's not the Er Kameshu B'Atzilus canal, as mentioned before. I'm going to move along, but any questions up till here? Any questions on this last section now? V'yadua, continuing on, v'yadua, and it's known, the beprotius yesh neshamas da'atzilus mamish. Now he's actually going to spell out levels of souls, which is something that's been begging, what levels, which soul here? I mean, we know the general structure. There's Atzilus, there's Biy'a, there's Atzilus within Biy'a. But what are we talking about? So he says now, Yadua, the beprotius, when you break it down, yesh neshamas da'atzilus mamish. There are souls that are associated with Atzilus mamish. We call them neshamas of Atzilus. It's obviously rare souls. These are the greatest souls of all, as he's going to spell out. Talking about Moshe, the Avos, Moshe Rabbeinu, the patriarchs. But they're called Atzilus mamish. V'gam k'moshe nimshachu b'Biy'a, and those souls, even as they go down into Biy'a, because those souls lived on earth. Moshe Rabbeinu lived on this world. The Avos lived on earth, so they came down into Biy'a. So he says these neshamas of Atzilus mamish, also when they come into Biy'a, heim b'chinas Atzilus mamish. They retain and remain neshamas of Atzilus mamish. In other words, they don't assume the properties and the personality of Biy'a. They travel through it. They don't bypass it. But it's more like an express train. They go through it, and there's some effect, but you can't say that they've assumed that you can call them neshamas of Biy'a. They're called neshamas of Atzilus. Kamoi nishmas Moshe va'avos, like the neshama of Moshe and the patriarchs of Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Chulu.
Rabbi?
But let me just finish a few things I want to say, then I'll stop for questions. But I am Ashikosa b'Lekutei Torah, and look in Lekutei Torah, or delve into Lekutei Torah. This is in Netzavim, Ba'Ibbur, the Seis Osis. I think it's Netzavim, or is it Kisave? It's in Dvarim, in the explanation of the Maimer Seis Osis. It's a very classic Maimer from the Alter Rebbe, where he talks that Moshe, when he spoke to Paroi in Mitzrayim, it was Atzilus speaking to the lowest of the low. So Moshe remained on the Neshama of Atzilus even when he came into Mitzrayim, speaking to a person like Paroi, who was like the head of all the klippas. He says there, but we have to look inside. I think there's some more details that will be helpful here. I'll look it up and I'll give you what I find. So that's the neshamas of Atzilus Mamish. Even when they come into Biy'a, they're called Atzilus Mamish. It's not finished. He's going to talk about next level of souls. Okay. Anybody wants to ask anything? Go ahead. Now is a good time.
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask a question from the last half-stack break when you asked about questions, which is the issue here of the effect, I won't say the function, but the effect of the parsa, which causes this dimensional degradation, relatively speaking, of the intensity of the light, the etzem ha'or, and as it's coming into Beriyah, and it loses this qualitative nature of Hiskalalus with all the different spheros. It loses that synergy as you use it, and then it comes into more particularized divine energy into the separate sphero and the kalim of Beriyah. So I got that point. He's made that point multiple times. My question is, like, why? I understand that the parsa diminishes the intensity of the light. It's a season shift. It's a dimensional shift. Hara v'ha'ara. I get all that, but what qualitatively, if you have, let's say, light coming through, I mean, I guess you could say a prism. You have white light going through a prism. It diffracts. It turns into different colors. I guess you could say it's a good mashal for how it loses its hiskalalus. Maybe that's the best example. But like, why, Davka? If light is light, it has the light in the kalim of Atzilus or the spheros are integrated. They share.
Yes, why God does it, or why should the parsa have that effect?
The latter.
Because that's exactly what God made. He made a parsa. So I think we have to stay away from the physical. The best example is a teacher that has to teach kindergarten children. He has to teach them Aleph Beis. Now we know Aleph Beis, ABC, is the language that you can learn the deepest concepts in Ayin Beis or other places. And yet children are going to just learn what is an Aleph, what is a Beis, what is a Gimel. So the teacher conceals quantitatively and qualitatively all the brilliance that lies within an Aleph and a Beis and a Gimel, and all the words that will come from it, and all the ideas, and ultimately the very vision of existence, what Hashem wants from us, the Tehora. So this is critical in order to be able to teach them. So it's going through a tremendous qualitative and quantitative. To say that they're not getting anything, you can't say that, because all knowledge is going to be built out of these letters. The example I gave earlier, like the teacher to an advanced student, the teacher to a lesser student. So in Biy'a, that's the whole point of Biy'a, is to be able to bring that energy to a point where ultimately we can understand and relate to it, and then climb, of course, the ladder as we grow. But initially, it goes through that, and that's exactly the role of the parsa. The role of the parsa is to be that partition, that type of filter, if you wish, regulator, and give a lot of words for it. Simtsum is another word, broader word that's used, but it's all a combination of all the above that does exactly that allows for the independent reality. In other words, if an neshamas remained connected and they were completely aware of the divine reality above, they would never be able to come to this world and do their work. So that's the purpose of it. So the process, that's exactly what God makes sure that the process is going to do enough diffusing that will allow any type of student or any makabel, any recipient, to be able to receive. Does it have to be that way? No. Obviously, scientifically, you can find a prism or find another filter that doesn't do it. But that's not the point here. The point is we need one that does do it, that does this level of diffusion. I don't want to use the word degrade or even eliminate, because Beriyah is a very high level. Beriyah is a level of malachim level of Gan Eden Elyon. So let's not minimize Biy'a. Just remember, Biy'a has tremendous Giluyim, but it's Giluyim that are quite like Atzilus and the total unification of Atzilus. And that's exactly what this parsa is meant to do. Now, each parsa on its level has its purpose. There are parsas that are more concealers, and there are ones that are more revealers. They're basically regulators, like we learned about the diaphragm, about the throat, about the membranes in the brain. They're essentially filters from level to level. The parsa between Atzilus and Beriyah, this is this function, to do exactly what I just explained.
I understand. Thank you. So so in order that ultimately when the energy for neshamas descends into asiya, it's how shall I say? It's allocated. It's an apportioned amount of elikus, of divine energy, such that it can fit properly into the kalim of our bodies, if you will, which are obviously not very bold.
I wouldn't talk about bodies yet. Right now, it's going from Atzilus to Biy'a, which is essentially from one spiritual state to another.
Yeah,
but it's now becoming an independent consciousness. The good example would be the difference between pregnancy and birth.
Okay, thank you.
1 second.
I think my question was that the parsa doesn't have to function this way. God can do whatever He wants, but in order that ultimately we can have neshamas that have this feeling, the sense of independence. What I want to say is the follow-up question, that the function of the parsa is such that ultimately when the energy descends into the bodies, I know we're in Biy'a now, but when it finally makes its way down to the lowest of worlds, it can give us this false sense of independence, which enables us to have choice.
One second. Hold on. We haven't gone there yet. That we're not reached there yet. Right now, it's going basically
I know, but
to Biy'a. Remember, there's another parsa and another leap between Biy'a and Yetzirah, and another one between Asira and Asiya. And remember, we still didn't get to Shchairani, where the soul comes down into the body. This is the first step, basically from the pregnancy of the souls in Atzilus to the birth of the souls in Biy'a. So I would wait.
I understand.
Okay, so
I'm just saying.
I would wait before we jump there. So okay,
no, I understand, but it's part of a progression, right? And
okay, but listen, since I'm teaching, let me do it in the progression that the Rebbe Rashab is doing.
Okay, I understand. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so now he's describing the levels of souls. So the first level of a soul is the Neshamas of Atzilus, mentions Moshe and the Avos, Moshe and the patriarchs, and even as they are in Biy'a, they're still on the Neshamas of Atzilus Mamish. But then there's another level of Neshamas. The Yesh Neshamas, the Atzilus Shebe Biy'a. There's Neshamas of Atzilus that are within Biy'a. This is already a second. It's not Atzilus and remains Atzilus. It's Atzilus as it manifests in Biy'a. And then there's a third level. The Neshama is the Biy'a Mamish. And then there's souls Mamish of Biy'a. So again, there's Neshamas of Atzilus Mamish. Even when they come in Biy'a, they remain Atzilus. There's Neshamas of Atzilus that come into Biy'a, which means they're assuming something from Biy'a. And then there are Neshamas that relate completely to Biy'a, even though they may originate in Atzilus, as he's going to explain. But there's 3 different levels of souls. That's all he says right now. Let's see how he elaborates. V'sheiresh kulam hu ba'atzilus. And the root of all these souls is in Atzilus. Also, number 2 and 3. The first one is obviously in Atzilus because there remains the Neshamas of Atzilus even below. But the second one and the third one are also rooted in Atzilus. So what distinguishes them? What distinguishes that they're assuming properties of the next level. One is Atzilus within Biy'a, like we learned earlier that even Atzilus in Biy'a is also after the Parsa. So it also is not like Atzilus Mamish. And then there's Biy'a Mamish. Okay. The and the root of all of them is Atzilus. The Im came. And so that being the case, Kamoy came b'chol neshama yesh b'chinas elu. Im kain kamoy kain. So too is it with every neshama b'chol neshama yesh b'chinas elu. Every soul has these levels. Kamoy shi b'chinas Ibbur b'beten ha'aim b'chinas malchus. I have to see where he's going with this. I'm not positive what he means. Does he mean that every neshama has all these three levels? Or does he mean something else? Not clear yet. Let me read on and let's see if it gets clearer. So he says, every neshama has these levels. The way it is, b'chinas Ibbur, b'beten ha'aim. The way it is, first in the Ibbur, in a state of gestation, pregnancy, in the mother's womb, B'chinas Malchus, that we learned before, the mother's womb is Malchus of Atzilus. Yeah. V'hu. And when does that manifest? As far as the calendar year goes, down with Yom Tov, he says, V'hu b'shmini atzeres. And that's a shmini atzeres, shu klitas ha'er v'ashefa b'chinas Malchus. I'll explain that in a moment. Let me just read it. Shmini Atzeres is the absorption of the light and the flow in Malchus. Shezeu shabitl de Rosh Hashanah v'Yom Kippurim. That is referring to the level that the bitl, the sublimation that happens on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, the be'etzem haneshama, the core of the soul, bo b'chinas pnimius, sheyi habitl hazeh v'hu inyan b'chinas yirei Allah. Should come in an internal way, that this bittul should integrate and completely be absorbed by the neshama, and that's the level of Yirei Allah, the higher level of Yireh. So let me explain what that means. Then he's going to go on to explain how it is in levels. Okay, yeah, I stand by what I said before. He is explaining how every soul has all these three levels. Atzilus Mamish, Atzilus in Biy'a, and Biy'a Mamish. That's what he's explaining, that every soul, even the lowest souls, have that. Now, Shmini Atzeres, I've mentioned, we talked about a bit. You know, Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, of course, are the highest days of the year. What is the Avodah of Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur? So often Chassidus says it's the Avodah Etzem HaNeshama. It's the Neshama in its highest levels. Sometimes the expression is Kiruv HaMoed Al HaNitzutz. During the 10 days of Tshuva, the soul is closest to its source. That's why people have the urge to do Tshuva. Different examples given for it. It's where the spark and the flame come closest together. And this builds Rosh Hashanah and through the 10 days and concludes Yom Kippur, especially the high point of Yom Kippur, Ne'ilah, at the end of Yom Kippur. So this is like the connection. If you're going to talk about the year round, that's the highest point where a soul reaches its can reach its deepest connection. And what connection is that? It's a level of bittul, highest level of bittul. That's what it really is. Like he said, bittul, he said, be'etzem haneshama. So then what is the role of Sukkos and ultimately Shmini Atzeres? I'm not going to address Sukkos right now. But I'll just say this, that which is reached in Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur and Sukkos begins to be integrated through simcha, through joy. So we're actually celebrating what we experienced on Yom Kippur. And that, when does that conclude? Shmini Atzeres. Shmini Atzeres, the conclusion, where it says, Shmini Atzeres, Kabbalah, Chassidus explains, is that which was born, conceived on Rosh Hashanah, and the conceiving continued through Yom Kippur. when is it, so to speak, niklat? If you think of it an example of a pregnancy, so you could have a seed will fertilize an egg, but you don't yet know if the pregnancy has taken hold. It has to be niklat. You can have the fertilization and then it doesn't end up in a pregnancy. That happens. So Shmini Atzeres is called klita. That's one of the reasons it's called Atzeres. Klita means it absorbs, that the egg actually gets fertilized. So essentially you're saying is that whatever happened Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur in Shmini Atzeres actually gets received and absorbed. In Avodah, that means that the bitl of Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur is still a bitl that can dissipate. And Shmini Atzeres internalizes it. That's what he calls a klita b'pnimius. Klita sa'oir v'ashefa b'chinis malchus. B'chinis pnimius shia bitl hazeh. This bitl should be in a pnimius, and he's calling this Yirei Allah. If you remember, Yirei Allah is what? Yerushalayim. So essentially, malchus is manifest. The klita, the pregnancy, takes hold on Shmini Atzeres. So he's saying that that's the level that every soul has, which is called this is the Atzilus within every neshama. Every neshama has that aspect, because every neshama began in a state of pregnancy and malchus of Atzilus. It's only afterwards that it's separated and moves into Biy'a. The difference will be with Moshe and the Avos, the neshama will retain its Atzilus personality. And with other neshamas, it will descend, and though it has it be'etzem, but it will ultimately come into a neshama either of Atzilus Sheba Biy'a or Biy'a Mamish. That's the distinction. But all neshamas are rooted in Atzilus, and therefore all neshamas go through these three stages. The question again is how much it assumes as it travels from the higher level to the lower level, or the properties that it assumes. So that's the first level, the level of Atzilus Mamish. And then there is second stage, U'kamay shehein beleda, b'bchinas leda. Then there's the neshama as they come in a state of birth, beyond Ibbur, b'Atzilus. So that would be a second stage. A third stage, U'kamay shebayim b'Atzilus sheba Biy'a, because that's still in Atzilus. It's not yet in Biy'a. However, it's Atzilus as it separates and becomes a separate life. Then there's how it comes Atzilus and Biy'a, and then level 4, Ubebchinas Biy'a, how it comes into Biy'a itself. So even though he began with 3, we said 3 types of souls, but in the process, once he's describing how it is in each soul, it's really 4. Ibbur, Leda in Atzilus, then Atzilus Sheba Biy'a and Biy'a. And here he adds that this is what we say in the morning, Neshama Shenasata be the 4 levels. Via Shleimer. And we could say Shehain, these 4 I just mentioned, Hein Adalad Madregas, Tehora, Boroso, Yotzarto. Doesn't, for some reason, doesn't mention Nofachto, but those are the 4. Tehora he, Ata Boroso, Ata Yotzarto, Ata Nofachto. The Tehora he, who Anashan Hashem, B'chinas Ayin Mamish, B'chinas Primis Akeim Atzilus. When we say Tehora he, that's referring to the level of the soul, as its neshama is ayin mamish, doesn't have any identity of its own. And why? Because it's completely part of the primis hakelim of Atzilus. Like it says elsewhere. And then Boroso would be the Boroso of Beriyah Atzilus. According to this, the word Boroso or Boroso is referring to Beriyah Atzilus. The problem is he skipped the Leda of level 2. That's what, okay, we'll see. Let's see what he says here. We'll see. Like he writes in the Geras HaKedesh, the above mentioned Geras HaKedesh, Chof, section 20, that when the neshama comes down, it's like the Kalim. So I guess he means that's Beriyah Atzilus. I have to look up inside. It's separate from, but it's like the Kalim. And the Kalim are the level of Beriyah Atzilus. No, my mistake. He didn't say Atzilus Sheba Beriyah. He said Beriyah Atzilus. In other words, he's saying level 2, like the level of birth, is Biy'a within Atzilus, because it's become like it's separate. It's not like Ibbur, which is Atzilus mamish. It's Biy'a within Atzilus. That's Boroso. That's level 2. Beriyah within Atzilus. Till now, he was talking about Atzilus within Beriyah, and then Biy'a itself. He's now bringing the levels Beriyah sheba Atzilus. The kelim of Beriyah sheba Atzilus. Yotzarto, who is Galus b'chinas Atzilus sheba Biy'a. Yeah, and the third level Yotzarto, which corresponds. Ato Boroso, Ato Yotzarto is like Boroso Yotzarto afasisiv in the pasuk in Yeshaya. For Nofachto b'chinas Biy'a. There we go. So Yotzarto is this Galus of Atzilus in Biy'a, and the fourth level, Nofachto, is Biy'a itself. So that's the 4 levels. What he added here is that the second level is called Beriyah sheba Atzilus. Just like there's Atzilus sheba Beriyah, the Beriyah in Atzilus is the kelim in Atzilus, but we're talking how they're already not Atzilus mamish, because there's Beriyah within Atzilus. So essentially, it's like the birth of the child, but it's not yet moved into Beriyah itself. So it's Beriyah sheba Atzilus, then there's Atzilus sheba Beriyah, and then there's Beriyah itself or Biy'a itself. Okay. He's still going to talk more about the neshamas of Moshe, where they fit in exactly in this picture. But right now they fit in, of course, to level number 1. But what he did say here is that every one of us, something we've talked about many times, that each of us on our level have subtly all these levels. And he now spelled out what they are. So we all have all 4 levels. Obviously, once we come down below, the biggest impact is the lower levels. But we originate, and we have even the level of Ibbur, of Malchus, of Atzilus, where the neshama is completely connected to its source. Yeah, and he compared that to the level of Shmini Atzeres, that is the Ibbur, the pregnancy that follows Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. Okay, interesting. Okay, I'm going to stop here. Firstly, let's take questions, and then we'll stop the class as well.
Rabbi?
Questions?
Rabbi, I wonder if the levels 2 and 3 exist within the parsa, within the membrane itself?
I don't know.
Perhaps.
Why is that relevant?
I'm just thinking about I don't know. Just
The
as
parsa is a spiritual. These are all spiritual states. The parsa's role is to allow for the shift from one state to another. So
the rabbi taught us that the parsa has a structure of itself.
That's fine. That's right.
An internal structure. So perhaps the 2 and 3 exist within that structure of the parsa. Who knows? Okay.
I don't necessarily go there. I would just say Atzilus is here, and then from Atzilus to get to the next stages, you need a parsa. But the parsa really is actually not between 1 and 2; it's between 2 and 3. That's what it sounds like to me.
Okay.
Because Atzilus, because 2 is still Beriyah sheba Atzilus. So I don't know if there's a parsa there between the 2. I'm not positive about that.
Mm-hmm.
I have to think about it some more. Right now, it sounds to me that the Ibbur and Leda are both in Atzilus, the Malchus of Atzilus. One is it's absorbed, and one with Malchus. Second, it's separated like Ein Hakelim. And then there's Atzilus that comes into Beriyah, and then there's Biy'a itself.
Mm.
Or Biy'a, yeah. I have to look it up more, but we haven't, yeah.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Sure.
Are there any practical examples for how you could distinguish a neshama that's, let's say, level 1? It's just in Atzilus, it's just a complete suffusion with Elokus, and then this Beriyah sheba Atzilus, which
it's basically 4 states of consciousness. Like he says, what happens on Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur and Shmini Atzeres, a person is in a heightened state where they're more connected to the so-called the Etzem HaNeshama, the Tehora level. And then there's levels, we've spoken about, I've spoken a number of times about that we daven 3 times a day. They correspond to nefesh, ruach, neshama, 3 levels, Biy'a, Yitzir, and Asiyah. On Shabbos and Yontiv, we add Musaf, which adds the 4th level, which is Tehora. And then there's Yechida on Yom Kippur, the 5th prayer. So it's essentially, these are essentially states of spiritual consciousness and awareness. And it all depends on a person's Veda of how deep you connect. So
Yes,
it really comes down to it. Yeah, I don't want to go into applying this in our personal. I mean, this is something we've discussed many times.
No, I know. I have a much more subtle question. So it sounds like, well, okay, I guess you don't want to do chesed supply, but the Inyan is that Biy'a Atzilus is the notion that there is some distinctness of the neshama, in some ways a little bit more separate from Elokus than just complete suffusion and Atzilus. Yet it's still an Atzilus, which is all Elokus. So it's kind of hard. It's a little bit of a paradox. Some sense of independence, some sense of self, some sense of apartness, even though it's an Atzilus. That's why I'm asking the question, because it's hard to conceptualize.
My training tells me that we should wait till we finish the whole subject, and then we can go back and explain how this applies in our personal lives. I'd rather not go there yet because I didn't finish the subject. I want to see all the details the Rebbe Rashab lays out. And then it'll be easier to see how that translates, because he hasn't finished. He's literally in the middle of a subject that's going to go another few pages. I want to see how it spells out when the neshama comes down below, and shcheirani, like the souls below, when they say, I am dark and beautiful, what their intention is when they're saying that to the neshamas above, because that's really the full discussion here. So I just would withhold personally. I'm not saying you or anyone else shouldn't try to apply it, by all means, but I can't really do that. It's just not the way I could think right now. Right now, I'm in the absorbing state, not the processing. So I'm trying to understand how he's laying out these pieces. So I think once it's understood, then I'll come back and try to explain it in the practical terms.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Okay, so we'll stop here by the end of parentheses, middle of page 1457. Any other questions before I stop the recording?